We can tear it apart. He's not here. What'd you agree with? What raised questions? What motivated you? Or is it just Tuesday after Thanksgiving and we want the semester to be over? Go ahead, Tim.
Well, I agree with pretty much all of it, but I would say that you should be careful talking about costly grace in that sort of way, or at least you should try to work on the way it's presented a little bit, because to me, I instantly started worrying about people taking that as saved by works instead of saved by faith, where you have to go out and do something to be saved by God, or you're not a Christian.
Yeah, it's important to read Bonhoeffer and recognize his context. He was writing in Germany in the 30s and 40s when the whole German church had sold out to a very non-Christian ideology, yet thought themselves, just fine because, hey, we sign our doctrinal statements, or we sing our hymns, or it was just recently I heard, was it something we read for this class where there was this, or something I heard in a talk, talking about, they told the story of a church in Germany that would, on Sunday mornings, they would hear the trains going by that were herding people to concentration camps while they were in their worship services. And eventually, of course, they learned, what was going on. And they talked about how when that happened in the service, we would just sing louder. We would sing our hymns louder. And basically they would block this out of their minds because they didn't want to acknowledge it or deal with it or whatever. But I think that's what Bonhoeffer has in mind when he talks about cheap grace. And you're right, there's a caution, there's a note of caution that should be sounded, but when we put Bonhoeffer in context, he makes a lot of sense. And I think he reflects Jesus. And the whole New Testament, really. But this might be a conversation for another day. But anyway, what else? Yeah, Matthew.
On that note, when Jared was talking about cost of grace, the way I understood it was he was just reminding us that when we witness for God, when we follow Him, there will likely be much loss in this world. Maybe not to the extent of His, but there will be loss. We likely will lose friends. We'll most likely lose job opportunities. And we'll lose something. But as Paul says in the New Testament, I count it all but loss. I count everything he had but loss. So the point I think Jared was making is we need to have the mindset that if and when we lose things, we're losing them for Christ, and that is the greatest gain.
Yeah. Well said. What we lose is actually the things that will rob us of true life and true joy. And so the sacrifices actually lead to that. And the other, so it costs something, but the gain is far outweighs that. But the other side of cost of grace is Bonhoeffer's making the point of what it cost God and Christ to secure our salvation, and that in a sense that demands a response, not to earn it, but to respond appropriately. What else did you hear that you want to talk about? You think evangelism is part of discipleship?
I think so. I think we're supposed to bear fruit and win souls.
What was the last word you said? Oh, win souls. Win souls. Yeah. So when Jesus says, go make disciples, we've actually often read that as an evangelistic command. So it's natural to think that evangelism is part of that. I wonder if it's broader even than that. Matthew.
I personally think it's actually the other way. Discipleship is a part of evangelism, because the point of evangelism is to bring others up to the point where they can start evangelizing others, and that necessitates discipleship. It's supposed to be a wave effect, a ripple effect. You affect one person, he affects another, and so on. But he can't do that well until he is discipled. So I have the viewpoint that discipleship is part of evangelism.
Yeah, it's kind of a chicken before the egg thing. Go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to agree with Matt and say that it's, I mean, when you're saved by God's grace, there's nothing else really to do on this world except for make sure other people are saved by God's grace. And really, what else matters that much?
Well, some of you didn't read the article yet, but what about, well, that's a great question to tackle after the break, because it's just what we're going to talk about. So, so Jesus, we'll just kind of tee it up here. Jesus came proclaiming good news about the kingdom, and he called disciples to follow him to proclaim good news about the kingdom. That is, to evangelize, to gospel as a verb, right? To share the gospel, proclaim the gospel. And he says at the end of his, like before he leaves them, go make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. Right? So discipleship involves learning to obey everything Jesus commanded, which basically means becoming like Jesus, continuing on Jesus' mission, which involved evangelism, which led to more disciples who were being discipled so that they could evangelize. But I think part of the question is, what is involved in evangelism? And we do kind of have this dichotomy, I think, in a lot of our Christian circles between evangelism and discipleship. Like, to be evangelized is to sort of hear the gospel and get saved, and then, at least the way it was in my world growing up, if you want to be serious, well, then you can get on with discipleship. And you know, if you can read Bonhoeffer and realize, wow, cheap grace isn't really the answer, I need to pick up my cross and follow Jesus. And so that's discipleship. Is it that neat and clean? Or is that a real dichotomy or a false dichotomy? So let's pick up that conversation after we take a few minutes to walk about and look about and do whatever you need to do. Let's come back at 11:40. All right, here we go. Living as gospel people. We've been talking the last couple sessions about the gospel as good news and about evangelism as the proclamation of good news. And so what does it mean to do that? I think Jared kind of invited us into that conversation. I want to take us a little further and maybe slightly in a different direction, but I think we'll circle back around to the question that he raised. But I want to start here. Maybe. How do we solve? You guys see the video panel? It doesn't matter. You can still see the words. How do we solve the pressing social issues of our time? Go ahead and give me some feedback on that question.
We ignore it.
Okay, that's one approach.
I'll just go Sunday school. Jesus.
Jesus, yeah, that's what. So I've been listening to a pastor during the pandemic from my parents' church, and he's talking about, the world needs Jesus, which is true. Anything else?
It doesn't go at all of them, but some of them, I think we should invest more time in teaching people how to be good parents, how to raise their kids well.
Yeah.
I think that is an actual deficiency in the church. We don't teach people how to raise their children well. And if we do that, it won't solve all of them, might not even solve any of them, but it will start to mend the problem.
So you're saying kind of if we've got social issues or social problems, if we work on the social structure and the social fabric, the core element of which is the family, then maybe we'll find some help, or that'll move us in the right direction.
And of course, with the church being the one that's trying to do the mending, most likely you will also reach more people that way as well.
Okay. Yeah. It sounded like Hannah maybe said something. You want to convey that? Someone in the classroom? You're too far away to hear.
She's telling Tim so that Tim can convey.
What Hannah's saying is basically things we teach against things like abortion and stuff like that, but we don't really offer as much help towards people after the fact, or people are going through that, or people are in a situation where they feel like they need to.
Okay, I agree. Let's make this a little more practical. Whoops. How do I do this? There we go. Why don't we? Whoa. Okay. Let's try this again. Why don't we name some issues? You guys just did one.
Oh, I was gonna say we vote on it.
Oh, okay. Because that's actually one thing we do, right, in our society. Is we vote. So we mentioned already breakdown of family, which is nothing new. None of these are really. That's been going on since the beginning of, well, since Cain and Abel. So always an issue. Life, which includes abortion, well, there's tons of things there. So for now, I'll just put etc. What else?
Racism,
Big one.
poverty,
Poverty. Come on. Okay, what else? Just shout them out. What?
Sexual immorality.
Yeah.
government power,
I'm going to add exploitation there. Government abuse of power.
religious,
Unpack that a little bit. What do you mean?
religious freedom,
Oh, okay.
Don't forget drugs.
Oh, yes. Let's see if I can do this. Let's see. Substance abuse, and the war on drugs, which started like when most of you were very small, but the idea that we put people in prison for doing drugs, some people think that's the wrong approach, so there's a whole big complicated issue there. Somebody else had another one? Is that you, Matt?
Depression.
Okay, I'm going to say mental health, anxiety, depression, etc. Those are kind of the big two that we talk about, but there's a lot of issues. Those are steadily rising.
homelessness, and obesity,
Okay, how about physical health, food industry? That's a whole issue in itself. And its effects on global health. Yeah, why don't we just leave it at that? Which overlaps with the mental health and other things on this list, but okay. Somebody else had another one?
Violence.
Violence. Yeah, okay, that gets its own line. How about corruption of justice?
Gender equality,
Okay.
homelessness.
I'm going to put homelessness here. Word with lots of S's. How about if we do inequality, including racism, gender, sexual orientation, etc. That's a pretty good list. That's probably enough because I ran out of slide. We're not even there yet, but there's a lot. We could say that our job is to share the good news with people so that they begin to love Jesus, and then they will learn how to love their neighbors. And we could say that we should bring families, they'll learn how to, I think it's interesting that God in his covenant with Abraham, he chose Abraham and he said, let me see if I can put my finger on it quickly in Genesis 18. He's saying, should I hide from Abraham? Yep, 18:17. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? This is Yahweh talking. Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he's promised to him. So God says, I've chosen Abraham so that he'll raise a family that will be righteous and just. And it turns out God wanted a really big family to be righteous and just, so that through that family, God could keep his promise to bless the nations. God's plan for the world is a family plan. So Matt, I think you're onto something. That's part of the solution. So we could focus on the family. If you've been around long enough, that might mean something to you. And we could preach the gospel and save souls. Should we do anything else about these things? Or kind of just let that work itself out? I mean, how does that work itself out? Tim?
It doesn't. If you leave people to their own devices, they always fall back into the same patterns of this.
Okay. So what's a better alternative? Or
For one, getting the world to recognize what godly patterns of life can do, and trying to work on the world through that lens. I think that helps a lot.
Okay.
And I still think saving souls is really important with all this as well, because even if you can't escape, and we never will get rid of all of this, we'll make it better for a while, but we fell back into this after so many revivals in our country, and I honestly think we need another one really bad, but we'll probably fall back into it again. But the one thing that can keep people safe permanently is by saving their soul with God.
Sure. Yeah. So salvation is important and primary in a sense. And the article that I had you read, or that you will read, talks about that, the idea of the primacy of evangelism, but it's also trying to say that it's never disconnected from a kind of social action that's dealing with the realities on the ground. And I think revival is an important word, because what happens in revival is people get exposed to the gospel and come face to face with God, and that changes their hearts and their view of the world. And it turns out then they begin to care about God's world and about the people in it. And then they begin to do things to help alleviate some of these problems. And I think that was part of Jared's point, talking about history. I mean, he was more focused on evangelism, but if you look at church history, it's always been that Christians are engaged in creating justice, working for peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. Helping people be free, helping people be healthy and whole, and protecting life, and giving to those in need. I mean, the scripture from beginning to end has this value on caring for the needy, and the vulnerable and the exploited, and the people who suffer when governments and other people in power, abuse power. All the way back to the Exodus, like, my people are enslaved and Pharaoh's being unjust, and it's time for judgment to come. I'm going to rescue them, and I'm going to bring down the hammer on this violent, abusive empire. And so when that story gets into our heads as people who come to trust King Jesus, then it works itself out in our lives. Real quick, because I was going to do it on this slide, you might be wondering why today, of all days in the semester long that we've been together, I'm wearing a tie. And I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but to share with you, if you don't know of an organization called International Justice Mission, they, for the last couple of years, for the last several years, there's been another organization that's partnered with them to help raise money to fight trafficking. This organization, IJM, by the way, was started by a Christian who experienced the aftermath. He was an investigator sent to, I don't know what exactly it was, but to investigate the civil war that went on in Rwanda, where people just slaughtered, each other, and he ended up starting this organization, the International Justice Mission, that's grown to be one of the world's largest anti-trafficking organization. So they're dealing with a lot of those problems that we just talked about: corruption of justice, slavery, sexual exploitation, and there's this other foundation called December that urges women to wear dresses every day of December to fight human trafficking. And several years ago, they started partnering with IJM, and some of the money that they raised was given to IJM to help them in their efforts to liberate women. Because it turns out that when it comes to slaves and sexual exploitation, women are the victims more often than not. And I mean, you can understand why. And so the last couple of years, I've gotten an email from IJM that says, hey, join us for December. Every day in December, wear a dress or a tie, because they've expanded it to include men, so that you can, when people ask you why you're dressed this way, which you guys didn't, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you, you can say, hey, I'm just raising awareness for the needs of men and women who are enslaved and exploited all over the world, and tell you about these foundations that are trying to help. And so this is just one illustration of what Christians have done throughout history. They hear the good news of a God who cares for the poor and the widow and the orphan, and then they see those people in the world, and their heart is moved to help them. So when we come back to the Great Commission, now tell me if it gets, you see the whole slideshow now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So when you come back to the Great Commission, and you evangelize people, you share the gospel with them, begin to disciple them, and teach them to obey Jesus, it turns out these are the kinds of things they do. So let me pause here and put in context a little bit. Actually, no, let me skip to here, and then we'll deal with the context on next time on Thursday. So, do you guys have Bibles with you, or can you pull out phones or something? I'm gonna have you guys read some of these texts, and I want to see if we can find the pattern. So, Grace, you have a Bible? Can you look up Mark 1:35 through 39? Somebody else, Matthew 4:23. Raise your hand if you got that one, okay? Matthew 9:35 through 10:8. Okay. I'll summarize Acts 3 through 5. Can someone be ready to read Acts 5:12 through 20? Here's what we see. If you may remember last week. Oh man, we can't do this right now. Okay, put a bookmark in those for next Thursday, because we're out of time. It's the first time I looked at the clock. So let me just pause there and say how fast 25 minutes goes. Anything you want to comments to close us with, or observations on this concept?
So no class next week?
No class next week, but class Thursday. And I will, this afternoon, I will create a discussion for the reading that was due today. So if you've already done it, you're fine, just contribute. But otherwise, it would be good to have that read for Thursday, because it'll give us some context and some common language for the rest of this discussion. And we'll tie up that loose end on Thursday. And then also if there's any other anything else that we've gone over this term in the different units and topics that we talked about, Revelation, theology proper, anthropology, or the gospel, that you feel like, man, I never really had a chance to ask this, or I never really felt like I got a satisfactory, I couldn't kind of close the loop on anything. Not that I'm promising that you'll be able to if you bring it up to me, but if you will send your question via text or email to me today or tomorrow, we can spend a part of our time on Thursday also discussing that. So anything is fair game. It's just, we're kind of just have time to tie up any loose ends. So feel free to send whatever loose ends you want to talk about. And I guess that's all I got. We're out of time. Happy Advent.